I'd like to invite you to the state dinner next week.
I'm gonna be there, Miss Reagan?
No. Not as a butler, Cecil. I'm inviting you as a guest.
But the president prefers for me to serve in person.
Don't you worry about Ronnie. I'll take care of that.
Criticism of the movie The Butler after it topped the box office this weekend, but raised questions about whether the film's attempts to rewrite history were fair. The controversy is over the portrayal of President Reagan, particularly in a scene which the president refuses to economically punish South Africa for its policy of segregation known as Apartheid. The movie offers no explanation. Critics say the representation is by no means fair or accurate. One even saying filmmakers, quote, engaged in ideologically driven fiction. Craig Shirley is the author of Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the Campaign That Changed America. He's president of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs as well. Craig, good to see you today.
Hi, Shannon. How are you?
I am very good. Now, I know that you've written in depth on the president. Give us an explanation for what was going on during that apartheid debate. And I haven't seen the movie, but is it accurate?
Well, I've seen the movie, and it's accurate to the extent that Reagan opposed the sanctions. It's not accurate to the extent as to why he opposed the sanctions. It was a very tricky situation. Everything in the Reagan administration and his presidency has to be judged in the context of the Cold War. We're in the Cold War engaged with what he called an evil empire. The only strongly anti-communist nation on the African continent was South Africa, but they also had a policy of apartheid, which we found equally repugnant. The sanctions would have hurt, according to what Reagan's briefings, his aides told him, would have hurt the least affluent among in South Africa at the time, who were the blacks there. And as actually the Zulu tribe, representing 6 million South African blacks, was vehemently opposed to the sanctions. Chief Buthelezi told President Reagan and told members of Congress, don't impose sanctions on South Africa because they're not going to work. And when Mandela came to power, one of the first things he asked for was for the sanctions to be lifted because they were hurting the economy of South Africa. So it's a very complex issue, and they present it in a very simplistic fashion.
Well, and even President Reagan himself, when challenged about his issue on race decades ago, said that when he was governor in California, he appointed more African Americans to positions than all of the previous governors combined. And those closest to him say that he did have a good record on that front. But there are also things in the movie that regard the butler there, seen by the actress playing Nancy Reagan, inviting him to a state dinner, that apparently in the movie it's made as if he feels that he's a prop at this dinner, that he's just there to show that there's some kind of diversity, that the Reagans cared about that, but maybe they really didn't. But apparently there was nothing in the writings of this particular gentleman that said he ever had a bad time there or felt like he was being used. In fact, the only comment I saw was that he was excited that he had champagne that night. Yeah,
that's right. That's exactly right. I saw the movie, and you're exactly right, is that he, in a soliloquy, says to himself that he felt out of place at the dinner, and that everything in his life went downhill after he attended the dinner. There's a lot of things. I'm all for historical fiction. John Jakes did it in the 1970s with about the American Revolution, and we've had historical fiction in this country from the time of Washington Irving. But when you take a complex issue like South Africa and present it as if Reagan was somehow racist, it's unfair to the subject matter and to the subject of that portrayal. There are other things too that aren't quite right, like him giving the butler cash to mail to people. There's no record of Reagan doing that. Reagan wrote checks to people who would write him letters when they were hurting during the recession of the early 80s. He would write them checks, but they would normally go to his secretary to be mailed to those people. There's before in that scene that you showed with Mrs. Reagan talking to the butler. Right before that, she's seen in the movie talking to an aide, and sounds like she's planning on her own a summit with Moscow, as if Mrs. Reagan was somehow involved in foreign policy, and that's ridiculous.
All right, well, when these movies are made, regardless of the topic, when there are politics involved, a lot of times the movies will say, there's creative license here, it's based on a story, it's not factual, but the people who go to see them don't always get that disclaimer. I mean, they think that, you know, if it's on the screen, it's been vetted, it's factual.
Right. And the thing, too, is you have to go to motive, Shannon, because the screenwriter for this movie did write the teleplay or the screenplay for Game Change, which was a lot of people thought was grossly unfair to Sarah Palin. And he also wrote the screenplay for Recount, which, again, a lot of people thought was a retelling of the history of the Florida recount in a way that made the Bush forces look very bad and devious, and the Gore forces look you know, saintly and good, and that wasn't really what really happened in Florida or happened in the case of Sarah Palin. So you do have to go to motive when it comes to Hollywood and movies.
Well, and as more and more people increasingly get their information from entertainment sources,
Yes.
you do have to peek behind the curtain and see what's going on, good or bad. Craig Shirley, thank you very much.